We want to extend our heartfelt thank you for helping Thread Talk hit the milestone of 100 subscribers. We couldn't be more grateful for your ongoing support. We are thrilled to have you on this journey with us, and we can't wait to bring you more engaging and informative content. Here's to each one of you. What's the darkest secret you found out about a family member? Story 1. One of my aunts raised another aunt's baby as her own. My mom had 4 sisters and a brother, all of whom got married and had kids, so I have around 20 cousins. Unfortunately, 3 of my aunts got breast cancer in their 30s. All 3 recovered, but years later the youngest, Maria, got it again and got it worse. Maria needed a bone marrow transplant. All her sisters and children got tested, but no one matched. The family then revealed that Maria had had a teenage pregnancy. Her first child was actually my cousin John, who had been adopted and raised by my oldest aunt as a second child. None of the cousins knew about this, including John, and is revealed to be adoptive siblings. John was asked to get tested and was a match, so he agreed to donate bone marrow to his birth mom, Maria. John was in his late 20s at the time and had very little contact with Maria over his life, so is pretty cool. The transplant took, but Maria eventually succumbed a year or so later. Story 2. My mother is the youngest of 4 kids by a hefty gap, about 11 years, and looks distinctly different from her siblings. They are all brown while she is a very light tan. Turns out Granddad violated and impregnated the daughter of a white military officer who stayed back after his country ended their colonial occupation. He was in his early 40s and she was 15 when he knocked her up. The agreement was he would take the child home and raise it as his own, and the officer wouldn't rip his balls open with a rifle. So my mom is half white European and I'm 1/4, which explains why my brother and I've always had the lightest skin and sharper features in the family. My mom found out when she was 16, I found out when I was 21. My grandmother was a freaking saint. Story 3. In my teenage years, my grandmother started dating a rough guy, and for about 4 years, we didn't see her anymore unless we were picking her up from the hospital after he beats her. I took it that we were disappointed in her decision to keep this guy in her life. After a recent visit from my mom, I found out that my grandmother's boyfriend was a large-scale drug dealer who routinely and without consequence beat people in public. The cops wouldn't pursue him, people who knew who he was wouldn't press charges. My mother and her sisters went to county law enforcement, and when they learned the man's name, looked up who he was, they literally gasped that this individual was in their county and that they could not discuss him further without consequence. My dad worked for a major hotel and resort and had the head of security, a retired Secret Service agent, make some calls. 2 days later, an FBI agent showed up in the doorway of his office, flashed credentials, and asked why my dad was looking into this man. After a brief explanation of the story, the agent told my dad, "Let it go," and left. The man was in my family's life from 1993 to 1997 when he died of a heart attack, while my grandmother died a few months later. We've speculated on everything from mobster to high-value witness protection program participant. I'm 40 years old and I still have no answers on this very dark chunk of my family's history. Story 4. My 2 remaining grandparents, my father's father and my mother's mother, married each other when they were 75. This made my mother and father stepbrother and stepsister. Since the son of my father's sister, my aunt, is my cousin, and the son of my mother's brother, my uncle, is also my cousin, I became both cousins. I am, therefore, my own cousin. I'll never be alone. Story 5. I'm the only child between my mom and dad, but they both had children from previous relationships. All of my siblings were 15+ years older than me. When I was 7, my mom and dad split because my dad had feelings for my mom's oldest daughter, who already had 4 kids. Okay, gross and crappy, but both are adults, so whatever. Cut to 13 years or so later, my dad is suddenly all in involved in the life of one of the kids of that sister. 20-year-old me was oblivious as to why this was happening. Took me another 7 years to put all the pieces together that my dad was the father of that kid. I had grown up thinking she was just a niece, but she was in reality my half-sister niece. I've never discussed it with anyone in my family. My mom died before I put all the pieces together. But wait, there's more. My family and I are all from Mississippi. My dad was born in 1945, so unsurprisingly, he's super racist. And I mean, super racist. That sister niece of mine ended up having 2 kids with one-legged black man. The one-legged part isn't really relevant except for him showing up to my house one day and suddenly doing push-ups in my living room for no apparent reason. Anyway, calm as a bish. Cheat on my mom with your stepdaughter, get her knocked up, basically have nothing to do with said child's life, then the child goes and commits, in his eyes, probably the biggest betrayal possible. I would throw a chef's kiss right here, except all I really care about from this story is the pain it must have put my mom through, and I was too young or oblivious to be there for her. Story 6. My paternal grandfather molested all his female grandchildren except for my sister and me. I didn't find out until I was in my late 40s when one of my cousins opened up to me. Nobody talked about such things in the Deep South in the 70s and 80s. Granny had no clue what was happening. Papa had a workshop in the basement that Granny wasn't allowed to enter. My dad might have had an idea that something was wrong, but I'll never know. He passed away before us girls started talking. The reason why my sister and I weren't hurt is because we moved away when I was about 10 years old. As for Papa, he was a pillar of the community. A Southern Baptist minister. Nobody would have believed him capable of violating anyone and incest. I'm going to go vomit now. Story 7. Discovered that my sister stole my father's $25,000 Rolex not more than 24 hours after he died. I only discovered it when she and her husband made a frivolous purchase, and I wondered where they got the money since they were always broke and begging my parents for money. I got suspicious. It hit me that she might have stolen and sold the Rolex. I had the paperwork, so I ran a track on the sales history and discovered it had been sold to a pawnshop down the street from where my sister lives. Went to the pawnshop, and after a bit of persuasion got them to tell me who sold it to them, and found out that it was my sister. Me and my mom disowned her. Story 8. My grandfather beat someone to death. My dad was an only child, but my grandmother was once pregnant with my dad's younger brother. When she was 6 months pregnant, someone in construction equipment ran over the car she was driving and she lost the baby. While she was in the hospital, my grandfather found the guy and beat him to death. From what I understand, he was in jail for about a week before he was released. Apparently, he claimed temporary insanity due to the circumstances. I learned all this about 4 years ago when my brother was researching family history and asked my grandfather about it. I've always seen him as a nice, little old man. Story 9. She was my best friend of 7 years, we had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her. After about a year, we had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said screw it, let's go back. She's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner, we all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan before us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him, she just needed a sperm donor. This all happened around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. Story 10. Found out the hard way that my grandfather was a sexual predator. Turns out my grandmother had been in denial despite both my aunts, their friends, and young girls in their small town claiming he assaulted and molested them. One 16-year-old even got pregnant and he paid for the abortion. Grandma lied about his whereabouts and activities for years to protect him because if he went to jail she'd be unable to afford their house. So, long story short, me and my then 10-year-old cousin were his latest and final victims. Story 11. Found out my birth father was still alive and living in California after being told for years he had died in the Navy before I was born. Fast forward a couple of years and a sister whom I was told had died at birth contacted me saying she had been adopted. Put all the pieces together and found out that my grandparents, mother then 16 and uncle then 14, were stealing cars in Southern California and running them down to Tijuana. When the feds started snooping, the whole family ran for the border and made it as far as Central America, where my mother discovered she was pregnant with me. They then turned north and made it to Zapata, Texas, where I was born. She gave me the name of her last boyfriend and told me he died in the Navy. Less than a year after I was born, she gave birth to my half-sister and gave her up for adoption, telling the family she was stillborn. My mother was a pathological liar all her life, and I didn't know until I joined the Navy at 17 and found my birth father was still alive. Story 12. Had some family move to Vegas with a local church's money, close to $1 million, to open a new church for them in Sin City. They gambled it all away. Came back, the church told them to piss off basically. They started their own church that allowed them to buy multi-million-dollar houses, brand new cars for them and their kids, basically a luxury lifestyle. They sell merch at the front door to the church, members are required to provide bank info, and they tithe 10% monthly income from all families. If you don't pay up, they kick you out. They tell you how to eat and exercise. If you don't follow, they kick you out. They put it in an old movie theater, so they have multiple stages. Full lighting and AV crews. They do love offerings when they need extra cash. God tells them to take trips, like he told their congregation God told them to ride motorcycles through the Grand Canyon. He even claimed he had healing powers for a short amount of time and got Saint tattooed down his arm. The whole 9 yards. At the beginning of the pandemic, when they were shutting everything down, they pressured their congregation to pay the 10% for the whole year up front. They've cut contact with all our family because we won't be part of their church. My cousin started a cult. Story 13. I recently found out that my grandmother took her own life as a result of the sexual abuse she received from her grandfather as a child. She was aged 8 to 14. Apparently her mother and many of her relatives were compliant with it and would even send her to his house for week-long visits where she would sleep in his bed. Story 14. My step-grandfather had a completely hidden life in Australia before he met my grandmother. He had a family and kids in Australia and faked his death by driving his car off a cliff, then moving to America. His kids thought he was dead until my grandmother found out about them and reached out years later. His son actually became a famous comedian over there, and from what I know has a joke he does at his shows about his father faking his death to disconnect from them. Story 15. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby she gave up for adoption 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3, and she also gave that baby up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was because my father married her, but that marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5 and my half-brother was born when I was 7. As far as I knew, for 59 years he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of it was found out is because of all of the DNA testing people now do. This discovery really impacted my sense of identity for a while, my view of my mother, and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings, an older sister and younger brother. I like them and I'm glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery really messed with me for a bit. Story 16. Both of my mother's parents had affairs without the other's knowledge. My grandmother had Parkinson's, and in one of her confused states, she told my grandfather that she had an affair. Suffice to say, my grandfather was not happy and put her in a home. He then started talking to my mother, trying to figure out when it could have happened. He speculated that it happened around the same time he was having his affair, which was around 1966. My mother was shocked. She was born in 1967. So my mother may or may not be related to the man she believed to be her father. Story 17. My parents had a nasty divorce, which was often accompanied by a lot of crap talking about each other. Most of which I would just ignore because it was incredibly immature and embarrassing, until one day my mom broke out the big guns. My siblings and I were just watching TV in the living room one day, and the conversation moved to my dad coming to town to visit, at which point my mom overheard. The mere mention of Dad prompted this woman to stop whatever she was doing, come into the living room, and say something along the lines of, "Talking about your dad again, huh? Did you know that he was molested?" My dad had never mentioned anything about it in the 18 years that I lived with him, which is understandable. To this day, I have no idea why my mom felt the need to blurt that out to the three of us, or why it is she thought that being the victim of sexual abuse was a stain on someone's character, but it was a really weird way to find out something so deeply personal about my dad. Story 18. My grandpa, who died back in 2017, was a very quiet man and didn't talk a lot. A few years before he died, my mom, his daughter, told me why. Apparently, when he was around 10 years old back in the late 30s or early 40s, a girl around his age lived across the street. One time they went out with his rifle to shoot at random things in the woods. On their way home there was a fence they had to get over to get home. My grandfather leaned his rifle on the fence to help his friend get over the fence since she was a girl. As she was going over, the rifle fell over and went off, killing the girl. After the cops got involved, he was found to not be at fault, but the girl's family stood out in the street at various times over the next 2 weeks, yelling "murderer" at my grandpa's house. He eventually couldn't take it and ran away from home. In his teens he met this guy named Rocky and befriended him. Rocky was supposedly in his early to mid-20s. Something happened where Rocky ended up passing away and my grandfather took his name. I had always wondered why my grandfather had a different last name than his brothers. Here is where it gets even weirder. My dad was adopted and until recently, we didn't know anything about his biological family. Well, thanks to all of the DNA tests that have become common, we ended getting connected with his biological family, to include his dad, my dad's dad, who is still alive and in his late 80s. Talking to that part of the family, we have come to find out that my dad's biological dad has almost the same story as my mom's dad. He also had accidentally killed someone as a child, ran away from home and changed his identity. If you've gotten this far and enjoying the content, please leave a comment of your own story. We'd love to make a video of them in the future. Story 19. My mom and dad decided to take in my 3 cousins because their mom got into a horrible car accident. 2 girls and 1 boy. The girls were 6 and 10, the boy 12. Fast forward to when the 6-year-old girl is 14 years old and is asked about birth control. She starts sobbing, saying her brother, who was then 12 years old, took her virginity when she was 6 and that it continued until she was about 13. We had no clue. Story 20. My uncle tells the story that when he was a kid, his older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up really early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did and way off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother starting to bring the shotgun up in his direction. He asked him what the hell was he doing. His brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to go back at that point. Later that week he went back and found a pit that someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Story 21. I found out that my great-grandpa got away with murder. He thought that my great-grandma was cheating on him with her dentist, so he went into his office and shot him. He got away with it too, and they didn't find out that he did it until he told everybody before he died. Story 22. My biological grandfather threatened to kill my grandmother while she was very young and pregnant with my uncle. Long story short, he was engaged to someone else. My grandmother became a nervous wreck while pregnant and wouldn't leave the house, and he used to throw bricks through the window. Eventually she told some of her friends about what he'd threatened to do to her. Shortly after that, he went missing, never to be seen or heard from again. We always kind of laughed and joked that one of her friends must have threatened him or ran him out of town. We would even go as far to say someone might have killed him for her. It wasn't until we were going through her boxes of photos and love letters we realized she was actually friends with the Cray twins, the foremost perpetrators of organized crime in the East End of London, England. Story 23. I found out from my dad that one of my cousins isn't related to anyone in the family. My aunt and her mother used to work at a hospital maternity ward, and apparently a woman came in one day and gave birth to him and then left the next day without him. My aunt decided to adopt him, but a few months later the woman showed up again asking where he was. They both lied that he was given up and didn't have a clue where he was. They still haven't told my cousin anything. Story 24. My father tried to kill my mother while she was pregnant with me. I found out about this when I was 20. My mom told me in private. She said back then my father had a drinking problem and he would get really violent sometimes. She said something to him one time, so he grabbed a knife, pushed her next to an open window and put the knife at her throat. Made her choose between jumping from the 4th floor or get her throat slit. My mom said she cried and begged him to not kill her and think of the unborn baby. Some neighbors heard the noise and intervened. They managed to take the knife away from him. She was safe. Police didn't get involved. This was during communist times, so back then apparently domestic issues like these were ignored. This was one of the times he was violent with her. My mom is religious and doesn't believe in divorce. They are still together after 45 years. His violent tendencies toned down after me and my brothers were old enough to knock him out if he tried that crap again. I'm the only one in my family, besides my mom, that knows this happened. I've always had problems with him, but I hated him bitterly after my mom told me what happened then and other times as well. I'm not a religious man, but I wish hell existed just so he could rot in it. Story 25. The 24 hours before my dad died from stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of the hospital's COVID rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then, he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl Ali for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her via direct message and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a crappy secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. Story 26. A few years before he passed, my dad and I had a long heart-to-heart, at the end of which, he told me he wasn't the one to first sleep with my mom on their honeymoon. He caught her in bed with her cousin, with which she was been in love with for a long time. He spoke with their pastor, who told him to forgive and forget. That worked, until 6 years later, when he caught her again, with the same cousin. He told me he wanted to leave with me but ultimately decided to stay, because he wanted me to have a family. With all that happened in my childhood, and to him becoming a workaholic, having diabetes, and suffering a heart attack, I wish he'd left and be happy instead. My dad told me that, before my mom and dad broke up, he hadn't been happy with her for several years. My mother even had a miscarriage at one point, which destroyed the both of them. But he couldn't leave her, because he was afraid that she would hurt or even kill herself. So his only thought was to have a kid with her, so that motherly instinct would hopefully prevent her from taking her own life. Story 27. My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915. He was the youngest of 10 kids, all a year apart, so his oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. My dad's father died in an accident not long after he was born, so Henry became the man of the house at about age 11. When my dad was about 9 years old, 1924, a gang of men came through their small town, kidnapping children to work as slaves picking cotton about 400 miles away. Apparently this was not an unusual occurrence at the time. My dad and 2 of his siblings were taken. Henry, who was now 18, came home from working on a cattle drive about a week later and found his mother hysterical about the kidnapping of 3 of her children. Being the man of the house, at age 18, Henry strapped on his father's 6 guns, dual holsters, 1 on each hip, and set out to get his 3 siblings back. He gathered clues about the gang from other townsfolk who also had children stolen. He headed east to where he was pretty certain the kids were taken, riding in empty train boxcars and even on the roofs of moving trains. It took him several weeks, but through talking to locals along the way who heard rumors of child abductions, he finally narrowed down to a few cotton farms where he thought the kids were. My dad, who was 9 years old at the time this happened to him, had tears in his eyes when he told me this part of the story. He and 2 of his brothers, along with about a dozen other kidnapped kids, had been held captive on this cotton ranch for over 2 months and had given up ever seeing home or the rest of their family again. They were kept locked in a barn, fed scraps, and forced to pick cotton in the hot Texas sun. They were beaten if they cried or refused to work. One day, working in the fields, they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up and saw my Uncle Henry walking towards them, and they started running toward him when one of their captors rode up on a horse and started yelling. Henry pulled one of his guns and shot the man dead. My dad wasn't even sure if the man had a gun, and it didn't matter. The gunshot drew a couple more of the captors over, and Henry killed them both as well. My dad ran up and hugged my uncle, and he told them, "Let's go home." My dad tells me they rode on and in train boxcars all the way back west to their little Texas town, along with a couple other kids that were stolen from the town. When they got back to their small farm, my dad said his mom fainted when she saw them. He said Henry put the 6 guns away and never touched them again. There was no law enforcement, no investigation about what had happened, that my uncle murdered 3 men to get his siblings back. It was basically still the Wild West in Texas in the 1920s. The boys eventually all joined the Army and Navy, and all served and survived World War II. My dad didn't tell me this story until after Henry had died. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a sweet, soft-spoken, diminutive, about 5'4", maybe 100-pound man who went on to own a printing shop. I would never have imagined him capable of the feats of heroics he performed, at age 18, to bring his family back together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Thread Talk for more content like this. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out. Have a dope day and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers!